It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just me, my daughter, and a truckload of memories as we moved her into the old family lake cabin. The air smelled of pine and fresh water, and the birds chirped in the background as we unloaded her things, one box at a time. The cabin had been in our family for decades, nestled just outside the bounds of the HOA that had sprung up over the years. We'd never had issues before. That morning, everything seemed normal until it wasn't. I had just carried a box of kitchenware into the cabin when I saw her. Standing across the gravel road, arms folded, sunglasses low on her nose, was Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. I recognized her immediately. She was the kind who showed up uninvited to board meetings, interrupted conversations, and took photos of people's trash cans to report violations. I didn't think much of it at first. I gave her a nod and a smile, then got back to unloading. She didn't move, just stood there watching us, then started walking up the path toward the cabin like she owned the place. I met her halfway, figuring she'd probably just say something passive-aggressive and leave. But no, she had other plans. She started with her usual, "You know this area is under HOA management, right?" I politely reminded her that my property was outside the HOA boundary, something that had already been clarified in a county land survey years ago. She ignored it, saying something about new guidelines and community harmony, whatever that meant. Then she pointed to my daughter's car, accusing us of unauthorized parking and claiming we were creating a disturbance. I was still keeping calm, not wanting to escalate things. I told her again, firmly this time, that we were on private land and her rules didn't apply here. She huffed and stormed off. I figured that was the end of it. I was wrong. About 15 minutes later, just as I was helping my daughter set up her mattress inside, we heard the sound of tires on gravel. I stepped outside and saw flashing lights. A sheriff's car rolled up right in front of our cabin. For a second, I thought maybe they were just patrolling the area. But then I saw Karen standing beside them, arms still folded, looking as smug as ever. She had actually called the cops. The deputy stepped out and walked toward me. I greeted him and asked what the issue was. He said there was a complaint about trespassing and possible unauthorized occupancy. I couldn't believe it. Karen had framed the whole thing as if we were squatters or strangers moving into a place we didn't own. I showed the officer my ID, the property deed, and the utility records. He checked everything, and within a few minutes, it was obvious we weren't doing anything wrong. The deputy apologized and said it looked like a misunderstanding, but I knew better. This wasn't confusion, it was control. Karen had tried to use law enforcement as a weapon to assert power she didn't have. She watched from the sidelines, hoping we'd be forced to pack up and leave. When it didn't work, she looked disappointed but not surprised, like this wasn't the first time she'd pulled a stunt like this. As the officer left, I turned to Karen and told her bluntly to stay off my land. She smirked and muttered something about just doing my duty. I walked back inside, but I was already thinking 10 steps ahead. This wasn't going to stop here. If Karen was bold enough to call the police on a homeowner doing nothing wrong, what else would she try? And if the HOA supported people like her, what did that say about the entire organization? My daughter looked worried. She asked if we were going to be okay living here with people like that around. I reassured her that we weren't just going to take it. I told her that sometimes people who crave control push until they hit a wall, and I was ready to be that wall. I wasn't just angry. I was motivated. Karen had crossed a line that morning. She had turned what should have been a peaceful family day into a confrontation, and she'd done it under the banner of authority she didn't even possess. I sat outside on the porch that evening, watching the sun set over the lake, turning everything gold. I wasn't just thinking about what had happened. I was planning what would come next. Because if Karen thought calling the cops would scare me, she was about to learn what happens when you try to mess with someone who knows exactly where the lines are and how to make them permanent. After the cops left and the sun began to dip lower behind the trees, I thought maybe the worst of it was over. My daughter and I were finally settling into the cabin, unboxing memories, setting up her room, and trying to get back to that feeling of peace we had come here for. But I could feel something simmering beneath the surface. The way Karen had watched us, the smugness in her expression even after the police had sided with us. It wasn't over. Not for her. The next morning, I stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee, hoping for a quiet start to the day. Instead, I was greeted by a bright orange slip taped to the front of the cabin. It was marked Notice of Violation with a list of absurd claims: unauthorized construction, improper waste disposal, and non-compliant landscaping. All of it was nonsense. We hadn't touched the landscaping, the garbage was still in the bins, and there was no construction, just my daughter unpacking a few things. But at the bottom of the notice was the kicker: a $500 fine and a warning that repeat violations could lead to community legal action. I shook my head. It wasn't even an official document. It had the HOA's logo, sure, but no legal references, no signatures, just scare tactics printed on fancy paper. Karen had clearly drafted this herself, probably thinking it would intimidate us. It only fueled my determination. I kept the slip, took pictures of it, and documented the condition of the cabin and property right then and there. Later that afternoon, my daughter came running into the cabin, saying someone was taking pictures outside. I looked through the window and saw Karen again, holding her phone up, snapping photos of the porch, the truck, even the interior through the windows. I opened the door and stepped out onto the gravel. She didn't flinch. I told her to stop photographing private property. She claimed she was gathering evidence of violations. I told her if she didn't leave, I'd call the sheriff myself. Again. She mumbled something about her rights and walked off, but I knew this wasn't going to end with a few idle threats. Over the next few days, the harassment continued. More bogus violation slips appeared. One of them accused us of noise disturbances, even though we hadn't done anything but play soft music while working. Another claimed we were using unauthorized utilities, whatever that meant. Karen was making things up as she went along, and each time, she left those slips without any explanation, just taped to the door like she was marking territory. She wasn't just trying to scare us. She was trying to wear us down. It wasn't just paperwork either. There were whispers in the community, people walking past the cabin slower than usual, pretending to be on their phones while obviously watching us. One man, who I later found out was a member of the HOA board, walked right up to me and asked if I planned to stay long-term or if we'd be moving along soon. I told him I owned the place and wasn't going anywhere. His smile faded fast. It was clear they weren't used to someone standing their ground. What struck me the most wasn't just the persistence, but the entitlement. Karen and the HOA acted like they had some divine authority over every inch of the lakefront, as if ownership meant nothing and their so-called community standards overrode actual property rights. They didn't see us as neighbors. They saw us as trespassers on their turf, even though the legal boundaries said otherwise. I began to understand this wasn't just about my daughter moving in. This was about control. They needed to dominate, to enforce, to remind everyone who was really in charge. But in their eagerness to assert that control, they made a critical mistake. They underestimated how much documentation I was keeping. I had photos, videos, dated notes, copies of every bogus notice. Every time Karen stepped onto my property, I logged it. Every time someone from the HOA made a false claim, I documented it. What they thought was an intimidation campaign was actually building a case, a clear, undeniable pattern of harassment. My daughter tried to stay positive, but I could see the stress in her eyes. She had just wanted to enjoy her new home, to feel independent and at peace. Instead, she was being dragged into a petty war of ego and entitlement. And that was the breaking point for me. It was no longer about protecting my property. It was about protecting her peace, her future, her right to feel safe in a place that was legally and rightfully hers. Karen had turned our quiet weekend into a battleground, and now I was ready to push back with everything I had. After the first week of harassment, I knew something had to give. Karen wasn't letting up, and neither was the HOA. Each day brought another ridiculous claim, another passive-aggressive encounter, another attempt to push us off land we legally owned. But I also knew something they didn't. This cabin and the property it sat on had a unique legal history, and that history was about to come back and bite them. Years ago, before the HOA even existed, my grandfather had purchased the lakefront lot. Back then, there were no gates, no committees, no arbitrary rule books. It was just open country, and landowners respected each other's boundaries. When the HOA formed in the early 2000s, they began pushing to include every parcel around the lake into their jurisdiction. Most neighbors agreed, thinking it meant better maintenance and security. But my grandfather, wise and stubborn, refused to join. He had insisted on keeping the property separate, registering it as an independent parcel through the county with clear documentation showing it was not part of the HOA's charter. I remembered this. I even had copies of those old documents in a locked cabinet in the cabin. So one evening, I pulled them out. Original land deeds, maps, surveyor notes, and a signed letter from the county confirming our exemption from the HOA's boundaries. It was all there, the legal backbone of our claim. What Karen saw as just another lake house was, in fact, a legal outlier, completely untouchable by the HOA's rules. And she didn't have a clue. That weekend, I went down to the county office to get updated copies of everything, just to ensure everything was current. The clerk pulled the file, confirmed the exemption, and even printed me a certified copy of the map showing the HOA's boundaries ending just before a property line. I smiled all the way back to the cabin. The HOA had no jurisdiction, no power, no say. But instead of going straight to war with that information, I waited. I want to see how far Karen and the HOA would go without doing their due diligence. And right on cue, they escalated. The next notice wasn't a fake violation slip. It was a formal cease and desist letter on HOA letterhead, claiming we were in violation of community bylaws and demanding we vacate the property until a compliance review could be conducted. My daughter was visibly shaken, thinking it was real. I calmly reassured her and filed the letter away, adding it to the growing pile of evidence. Then came a cherry on top. A letter sent by an HOA board member stating that failure to comply would result in legal action, civil court filings, liens, and community-imposed penalties. That's when I decided enough was enough. I scheduled a meeting with the HOA board and arrived armed with every piece of documentation they had chosen to ignore. The meeting was held at the local clubhouse, where HOA business was typically conducted. Karen was there, along with 3 board members. I walked in with a binder full of maps, deeds, and county-certified letters. I didn't shout or threaten. I just laid everything out on the table. I showed them the land parcel numbers. I pointed out the HOA charter boundaries. I let them read the county's exemption letter out loud. Silence fell over the room as they flipped through the pages. One of the board members quietly admitted they had never reviewed the county files before launching their campaign. Karen, on the other hand, doubled down, claiming the documents were outdated and probably invalid. That's when I handed her a freshly dated certification from the county registrar, stamped and signed just 3 days earlier. That shut her up. I told them that moving forward, any further attempt to enforce HOA rules on my land will be treated as harassment and reported to the sheriff's department. I also let them know that the next time anyone stepped on my property without permission, it would be trespassing. I wasn't bluffing. I had already spoken to a lawyer. The HOA wasn't just overreaching, they were breaking the law. After the meeting, I walked out and felt the weight lift off my shoulders. I had always known we were in the right. But now, the HOA knew it too. They had no legal leg to stand on, and the more they tried to intimidate us, the deeper the hole they were digging for themselves. Karen's campaign wasn't just petty. It was built on a complete misunderstanding of property law. And that misunderstanding was about to cost her and the HOA more than they realized. With the evidence stacked in my favor and the HOA's legal footing crumbling beneath them, I started looking deeper into the documents I'd gathered. The more I read, the more I realized the HOA had made a massive mistake, not just in harassing us, but in assuming they ever had the right to do so. That's when I stumbled on the detail that would change everything. In the original land survey recorded with the county, there was a clause buried in the footnotes stating that no easement, access right, or governing body jurisdiction shall apply to this lot unless voluntarily agreed upon by the title holder in writing. That meant unless I signed something handing over authority to the HOA, which I never had, they had absolutely zero power over anything that happened on my land. I started doing my own research into how HOAs work, how their power is structured, and most importantly, how they lose it. Turns out, many of them rely not just on voluntary compliance, but on the ignorance of property owners. They thrive when people assume they're bound by rules they never actually agreed to. In our case, the HOA had no documentation, no contracts, and no signed acknowledgement from my side. Their entire argument was built on assumptions and neighborhood gossip. I met with my attorney and showed him everything I had. After an hour of reviewing the documents, he looked up and said, "They don't have a case. You're not only exempt, you're in a position to reverse the pressure." That's when the idea hit me. I didn't want to just defend myself. I wanted to make sure they never did this to anyone else again. If they were going to weaponize their authority against people like me and my daughter, they needed to be shown what happened when they messed with the wrong family. The cabin property included a long strip of shoreline with a small, gravel access road that ran right through the edge of my lot. It wasn't heavily used, mostly by HOA members walking their dogs or taking shortcuts to the community dock. I'd allowed it for years out of courtesy, never once thinking to restrict it. But now, I realized I had full legal right to fence it off or post it as private. And if I did, it would cut off easy access to a section of the lake that the HOA loved to brag about in their community flyers. I filed paperwork to revoke the permissive use of the path, marking it as a private access point only for family and invited guests. I put up signs, installed a gate at the entry, and even added a camera system for security. Legally, they couldn't touch it. That gravel road was on my deeded property, and any previous use by the HOA had never been formalized. It had been tolerated until now. Within 2 days, Karen showed up demanding I take the signs down. I calmly handed her a copy of the updated property notice and told her to have her lawyer call mine. She left without another word. The pushback came fast. Emails from HOA board members, complaints from residents, and even a formal request to reinstate access. I denied every one of them. I was no longer playing defense. I was setting boundaries, literally and legally. And the beauty of it was, there was nothing they could do. Their bylaws didn't apply to me. Their threats held no legal weight, and their access point was now closed for good. What had once been their assumed territory was officially off limits. Then came the final move. With help from my attorney, I sent a cease and desist letter directly to the HOA board, detailing every instance of harassment, the legal boundaries of my property, and a formal declaration that any further attempt to enforce HOA policy on my land would result in legal action. I included photographs, timestamps, and copies of their bogus violation notices. The letter didn't ask, it ordered. And it was backed by enough evidence to make them think twice. I never received a direct reply, but within the week, the violation notices stopped. The passive-aggressive stares disappeared. Even Karen, once the queen of confrontation, avoided eye contact when she passed by. They hadn't just lost a battle, they had lost control. Their entire premise had been based on assumed authority, and once it was taken away, there was nothing left but empty threats and quiet retreat. The most satisfying part wasn't just the silence. It was knowing that by asserting my rights and backing them with law, I had stripped the HOA of their illusion of power. They could no longer use rules they never had to control people who didn't bow to them. Karen's calls, her papers, her arrogance, all of it had been dismantled not by shouting, but by showing her exactly where the line was and daring her to cross it again. After the cease and desist letter went out and the gravel road was locked behind a brand new gate, the air around the lake started to shift. It was subtle at first. Fewer people wandering near our cabin, a noticeable drop in the passive-aggressive foot traffic, and complete radio silence from the HOA. But it wasn't just about keeping them out anymore. The more I thought about what had happened, the more it became clear I needed to make a permanent change. It wasn't enough to hold the line. I had to draw a new one, in ink, not pencil. I started by documenting everything in formal detail. Every violation notice, every instance of harassment, every picture Karen had taken through our windows, all cataloged and dated. I wasn't just preparing a personal archive. I was creating a record that could be used to protect my property long-term. I took it a step further and filed a public complaint with the county records office, attaching evidence and a written statement clarifying that my parcel was not, and never had been, under HOA jurisdiction. That submission triggered an update to the property's digital record, making it officially searchable in public databases. Anyone researching our land from that point on would see clear legal documentation. Non-HOA property, exempt from governance, private access only. Next, I focused on signage. I didn't want just a few polite warnings. I wanted anyone who stepped foot near our lot to immediately understand they were trespassing if they didn't belong. I posted bold, laminated signs on every corner of the property, private property, not affiliated with HOA. No trespassing, no access, no exceptions. I even included a QR code linking directly to the county's land registry map, confirming my exemption. It wasn't just about telling people to stay away. It was about backing every word with evidence they couldn't argue with. Kara tried to make one last push. A handwritten letter showed up taped to the gate, and signed but unmistakably her tone. It claimed that our actions were disruptive to the community spirit and requested we reconsider our stance for the sake of neighborhood unity. I didn't respond. Instead, I photographed the letter, filed it away, and had a copy delivered to my attorney with the rest of the growing paper trail. If they wanted to keep pushing, I was going to keep building a case so airtight it could suffocate any complaint they try to bring. But I didn't stop at defense. I turned the tables entirely. I reached out to the county and filed a request to block any future HOA inclusion attempts. There was a little-known provision in our jurisdiction's property code that allowed landowners to register a permanent non-governing parcel status, basically a formal legal barrier that ensured no future HOA could ever extend its power over that land, even with a vote or amendment. After reviewing our case and documentation, the county approved the request. That cabin and the entire stretch of shoreline connected to it became officially HOA-proof. That decision did more than just protect me. It set a precedent. The moment the paperwork went through, the HOA lost any hope of ever expanding their reach in that direction. Their boundary, once flexible and expanding, now had a hard edge, a legal firewall they couldn't cross. They had overplayed their hand, and in trying to dominate one parcel, they lost their grip on all the ones around it. Soon, word started spreading. A few neighbors who had long been frustrated by the HOA's overreach came to me quietly, asking how I had done it. I walked them through the process, shared my documents, and even connected them with my attorney. What started as one man pushing back had become a ripple effect. Karen didn't just lose her battle with me. She was losing her influence entirely. I took one final step. I added a clause to the property's deed stating that any future transfer of ownership would include a binding declaration of independence from the HOA. No new buyer, renter, or family member could ever voluntarily join it. That piece of land would remain free no matter what. My daughter could live there without fear. My grandchildren, if they ever wanted to, could walk the same shoreline without being harassed over mailbox paint colors or unauthorized lawn chairs. The lake was quiet again, but this time it was on my terms. I had turned my property into an HOA-free zone, not just physically, but legally, permanently, and undeniably. The community might have still had its rules and self-appointed rulers, but they no longer applied here. And every quiet evening on the porch, every ripple across the water, reminded me that I hadn't just reclaimed space. I'd reclaimed control, not through anger or confrontation, but through clarity, persistence, and the power of knowing exactly what was mine and defending it with everything I had. The days after I finalized the legal protections over the cabin property were oddly peaceful. There were no more letters, no more knocks, no more Karen pacing at the edge of the property line with her phone out. It felt like we had finally secured what should have never been under threat in the first place: our right to live without interference. My daughter was starting to settle in, planting flowers out front, decorating the cabin with her own touch. For the first time since moving in, she looked like she belonged there. But beneath the calm, I knew something else was happening. The HOA wasn't just retreating. They were unraveling. Word had gotten around. Once I had locked down the legal boundaries, other homeowners started questioning just how much authority the HOA really had. A neighbor 2 lots over approached me quietly one morning and said, I didn't know we could opt out. That was the spark. I explained everything I had done, and he started digging into his own property records. Within a week, he discovered that the HOA had added his parcel to their map years ago without any formal agreement. No vote, no consent, no legal basis. Just paperwork quietly filed and never contested. Others followed. Families that had lived along the lake longer than the HOA had existed started pushing back. Some requested boundary reviews. Some filed complaints about the fees and fines they had paid under false pretenses. One neighbor even demanded a full refund for 5 years of dues after proving his property had never technically been under their jurisdiction. The board scrambled to respond, but every time they tried to assert authority, someone pointed to my case and said, "Then explain how you lost control of that lot." Karen, once the face of the HOA, started to disappear. She stopped attending board meetings in person and sent emails instead. Residents who once feared her began openly mocking her behavior. She had gone from enforcer to cautionary tale. The woman who had confidently called the cops on me was now the one being questioned at every turn, her credibility slipping through her fingers. The HOA board tried to save face. They held an emergency meeting to review their governance policies and reconfirm boundary authority, but all it did was expose how loosely they had been managing things for years. Someone leaked internal emails showing how they had used intimidation rather than legal process to get compliance. The board president resigned quietly a month later. 2 more followed. At the same time, I began noticing something else: people treating our property differently. Where once there had been confrontation, now there was respect. Neighbors asked permission before approaching the shoreline. No more wandering onto our dock. No more stepping onto our gravel road like it was part of public trail. The gate and the signs were still there, but they were no longer necessary. The message had gotten through. We weren't just outside the HOA. We were untouchable by it. My daughter, who had been nervous about starting her life in the cabin, now hosted friends without fear. She held small bonfires by the lake, played music without being reported, and even started kayaking without being stopped by concerned residents. She had gone from being a target of their suspicion to a symbol of independence. Watching her thrive in that space was the clearest reminder of why I had fought so hard in the first place. The impact stretched further than I ever expected. A local reporter got wind of the story and reached out for an interview. I declined, not wanting to stir the pot again, but the story made it into the local paper anyway. Under the headline, "Lakefront Owner Bans HOA, Sparks Community Shake-Up." It was more accurate than dramatic. My case had caused a shift in the way people viewed authority around here. The HOA had gone from being an unchallenged force to something people questioned, pushed back against, and in some cases, rejected entirely. What started as one woman's power trip had triggered a complete transformation in how property owners viewed their rights. It had exposed the weakness in the HOA's foundation, not just their lack of jurisdiction, but their reliance on fear and assumption. Once that illusion was broken, it didn't just fall apart on my lot. It started falling apart everywhere they had overstepped. Neighbors who had been bullied into silence began speaking up. People started reading their deeds, attending meetings with questions instead of compliance, and demanding documentation. It was no longer enough for the HOA to bark rules. They now had to prove they had the leash to begin with. And more often than not, they didn't. The cabin, once caught in the middle of their storm, now stood as a line they could no longer cross. The gravel road, the lake access, the shoreline, everything Karen thought she could regulate was now out of her reach. And she knew it. She had watched her power shrink while we reclaimed our peace, watched her tactics turn into examples of what not to do. She had gone from self-proclaimed protector of the neighborhood to its biggest embarrassment, all because she picked the wrong battle with the wrong family on the wrong piece of land.